One.
Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar brought to you by ESI Africa and Frost Sullivan. My name is Claire Falkvan and I'll be your moderator for this afternoon. Today we're going to be discussing the megatrends facing the power and energy sector. Having a grasp on what the energy landscape may look like by 2025 is an important step to securing your place in the marketplace with both your local and foreign counterparts. Research and analysis has identified 4 key focus areas that are globally shifting the energy landscape: distributed energy, smart metering, energy storage, and e-mobility. And these are the key focuses of our webinar this afternoon. Please note that you are welcome to ask any questions of our speaker, Travis Hoff, during the course of the presentation by putting your question into the question box on the left-hand side of your screen. I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce Travis Hoff, who is the Business Unit Leader for the Energy and Environment team at Frost Sullivan Africa. Travis has over 14 years of industry experience across a range of different divisions within the resources sector and has managed the due diligence of resource projects in multiple sub-Saharan African countries. He joins us today to share his insights on megatrends within the energy industry. Travis, over to you.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Claire. So I believe there are people calling in from different parts of the world. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you all. And thank you for making the time to be part of this analyst briefing. Today's briefing is on the topic titled Megatrends That Will Transform the Energy Industry. This presentation takes a closer look at what the global energy megatrends are and how they are playing out in a global context as well as from an African point of view. As you will see, there are quite a couple of factors that will impact and shape the energy landscape, but I will focus on 4 key factors that Frost & Sullivan see as having the biggest impact. I've tried as much as possible to give examples of where the trends will impact Africa, but given many of the developments are at the early stage, even in developed countries, examples relating to Africa can be difficult to come by. Be that as it may, I'm sure you'll find the presentation interesting. So without further ado, I'd like to kick off. So at Frost & Sullivan, we believe the energy sector of the future will be driven by the 3 Ds, as we call them: decarbonisation, decentralisation, and digitalisation. Looking firstly at decarbonisation, whether you're a believer in global warming or not, the world is becoming greener, the result of which is the move towards a low-carbon future throughout the energy value chain, including generation, transmission, distribution, and usage. By 2025, I believe 44% of global generating capacity will be from renewables, with an added renewables capacity 1,600 gigawatts. The second of the 3 Ds is decentralization, which will see new distributed generation models and an increase of distributed and connected generation closer to the point of use. By 2025, Frost predicts 12% of global generating capacity will come from distributed generation sources, with 65% of distributed generation investments being solar PV. Moving now on to the last of the 3 Ds, we come to digitalization. Digitalization, to some extent, is an enabler for the first 2 Ds, in that it will provide infrastructure and data, making energy more flexible, intelligent, connected, and responsive. It will form the backbone of smart grids and allow things such as asset optimization, demand response, automated trading, and active energy management. By 2025, the impact on the energy sector will be in the region of $1 trillion. The 3 Ds, though, we don't believe can be looked at in isolation and are not the only points to consider. We see 10 converging factors that will define the future of energy. Carbon reduction, market decentralization, and IoT, we have touched on to some extent with the 3 Ds, but there are also factors such as new business models. This is particularly relevant for the utilities who will have to adapt in this rapidly changing environment to ensure they are relevant in the future. E-mobility, energy efficiency, big data, smart cities, and the circular economy are all factors that are going to have to be taken into account when looking into the future of energy. Water stress is a major issue for Africa, given our lack of this precious commodity and our issues in managing it. Excuse me. The lack of water, therefore, will play a part in the energy sector and could determine the type of energy generating technology that is used to supply power, or even dictate the need for extra electricity capacity if one is looking at setting up desalination plants. Whilst we have pointed out a total of 10 factors that will shape energy in the future, given our world is becoming more digital, I would like to focus on the 4 biggest game changers that will shape the digital energy roadmap from a global perspective. They are distributed energy, smart metering, e-mobility, and energy storage. Looking firstly at distributed energy, we will see growth in sectors such as small-scale PV, hybrid power plants, and advanced microgrids up until about 2021. Ultimately, by 2025, we expect baseload power being provided through renewables. Smart metering will give rise to greater customer engagement tools and demand-side management. By 2023, big data will become a part of managing both supply and demand of energy. And by 2025, 80% of the energy market in America and Europe will be covered by smart metering. E-mobility, a sector that is largely linked to energy storage and distributed energy, will see the mass production of 48-volt hybrid electric vehicles, or HEVs. By 2021, the lithium-ion battery price will be less than $250 per kilowatt hour, a key break-even point in that it is believed at this point it will become economically competitive with ICE vehicles, or internal combustion engine vehicles. Vehicle-to-grid supply will become commonplace, together with the uptake of plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. Fuel cells, the long-talked about energy source, is predicted to become mainstream only by 2025. Finally, energy storage will see the progression from being used to power ancillary services to being used by utilities for smoothing out energy supply and incorporating renewable energy. Ultimately, by 2025, we see all renewables being integrated with storage and, in essence, creating renewables as a baseload source of power. Based on previous Frost research, I would like to give you more insight into these 4 game changers and how we expect them to evolve over the coming years and their impact from an African perspective. I'm going to start with distributed energy. So first up, we see energy produced by fossil fuels continuing to decline. The share of electricity from wind and solar will rise from 4.3% in 2015 to 8.4% in 2025, whilst installed capacity will increase from 9.4% to 14.2% over the same time frame. Distributed generation will also nearly double from 7% to 13%. Utilities will operate under a different business model and will no longer just be owners and operators of centralized power plants, but will transform to service-based selling and promotions of energy efficiency and clean energy. By 2025, we expect to see self-generation becoming more mainstream, with electricity supplied by prosumers being competitive with those from utilities on a cost per kilowatt hour basis. Distributed energy resource management systems, or DERMS, will also become an established landscape, but will be more consolidated in nature than it is now. The graphs here give a graphical breakdown of electricity generation as we predicted for 2012 and how this has changed for our prediction in 2025. As can be seen, renewable and distributed generation is challenging conventional power generation. Although centralized generation will still account for a majority share of electricity production in 2025, the strong rise in renewable and distributed generation will have an impact on every part of the electrical system, starting with generation and all the way down to the end user. Coal and gas are the biggest losers of market share, whilst installed capacity additions of renewables will outstrip fossil fuels by 2020. Looking at the growth of distributed generation, installed capacity of distributed solar PV is expected to grow at a compound annual growth rate of 14.5% between 2015 and 2025. A key turning point is 2023, where, based on Frost analysis, we expect distributed generation capacity addition to exceed that of centralized generation additions. The biggest change in energy makeup, comes from a distributed generation point of view, will be a decrease in diesel generation, which will be replaced by distributed PV. Combined heat and power will decline in the coming years, and based on PV, the top countries will be Germany, Japan, and the US and China. Looking at the impact of an increase in distributed generation, one of the biggest impacts will be the change in business models for utilities. Falling prices of solar panels and energy storage, improved energy efficiency, and better integration of renewables to the grid will drive new business models for the utilities by 2025. Utilities need to capture opportunities in distributed generation downstream in the value chain by vertically integrating their business and building on their existing customer base through product innovations and acquisitions. If we look at the growth strategies available to utilities, geographic expansion is a short to medium-term strategy, and whilst opportunities exist in emerging markets, they can be high risk. However, if we look at the value chain sector that utilities can pursue, the first of which is their customer segments, they can focus on other participants in addition to end users in the value chain. For example, partnerships with energy companies. Next is value chain creation, where they can provide new energy services and products down the value chain, for example, electric vehicle infrastructure. Finally, value delivery by adding value to the existing portfolio by enhancing products and services through things like data management and consultancy. The total value chain focus presents a 10 billion opportunity by 2020. Just by way of example, this change in business model by the utilities is already happening. Germany's E.ON announced in 2014 that it was splitting off its centralized power assets in order to make itself a distributed utility and embrace what it termed the new world of energy. The company believes that the conventional energy world will continue to exist and still offer well-positioned companies attractive opportunities. However, the new energy world offers considerable growth, and by splitting the two businesses, it is able to focus more on the new world of energy. Now, in a similar vein, utilities, there will also be different business models required to set up microgrid or distributed generation, and they will be different for different parts of the world. So looking firstly at the community-based model, in remote places, the private sector or utility may not have the interests to develop grid infrastructure. Onus is therefore on the community to own, operate, and maintain the grid. Especially in developing countries, many suppliers form cooperatives that are in charge of providing electricity to the community. For medium-sized systems, they are co-owned by municipalities. Looking at the private sector-based model, private sector companies can play an important role in developing microgrid infrastructure. Government support in the form of subsidies is an important incentive for companies to invest in the space. A prudent rural electrification program with a sound economic benefit will be a major driver for private participants to tap into the market. Moving now to utility-based model. The biggest potential for developing microgrids is in remote places. It's important for the stakeholder to have the financial resources, technical competence, and the government backing to support these projects. In many developing countries, the utilities are public or quasi-public companies. Hence, they have the access to financing mechanisms and cross-subsidies to support the low-revenue markets. Finally, there's the hybrid model. Hybrid business models can be quite diverse in terms of their ownership and types of operation and maintenance contracts. It can be a combination of private and utility or private and community, or in some cases, all three.
Travis, sorry, I hope that you'll excuse me for interrupting you here, but if I may pose a question that has been asked, what type of model do you see working specifically in an African context?
Well, the community model works quite well in places like Europe, where rural communities, or as rural as they can be in Europe, have higher disposable income. In Africa, this is not necessarily the case, so I'd say it's unlikely. A private model can work, but it's very expensive for a private individual or private company to set up both the power generation and distribution. The utility model is also, I'd say, fairly unlikely, as most state-powered utilities in Africa don't have great balance sheets. Therefore, I see a hybrid model working best. The private investor or private sector can set up the power generation, for example, and the utility can deal with the collection or distribution of the electricity and the collection of payments. So this will be playing to the strengths of the utility, and then it can also play to the strengths of the private investor who has more skill in bringing online solar and wind-powered projects. The problem, though, is where, due to the natural expansion of the grid, any agreement that was agreed between the private sector and the utility becomes, to some extent, a conflict of interest, in that the utility will want to supply their customer off their own generating base and not have someone else supplying them. So in a way, it's similar to the issues that's currently being faced with the power purchase agreements and Eskom and people that have set up renewable projects here. I don't want to go too deep into that because it becomes quite politicized, but there are still risks associated with this hybrid model. So to answer in short summary, it is the hybrid model that I think will work best, but it's not without risk.
Thanks very much. I hope that answers the question, Nicholas, who asked it. Thanks very much, Travis.
Great. That actually leads me quite nicely into my next slide, which is the African Geographic Hotspots for Microgrids. So starting off in Mali, there's a significant number of small diesel mini-grids, many of which are privately owned. Many of these diesel-based mini-grids are in the process of hybridization through integration of solar PV. There are subsidies that are provided to support such projects. For Senegal, there's a well-regulated two-pronged concession approach for private sector involvement. 80% upfront subsidy for private investors for grid extension and off-grid electrification. Many concessions for private micro-utilities for standalone microgrids in remote communities. However, the scaling up of pilot projects, regulation and tariff uncertainties do remain concerns. For Kenya, we have rural electrification as the main driver for development of renewable mini and microgrids in the country. Development of mini-grids in Kenya has been fueled by increasing private sector participation and also supportive regulatory changes. Looking at Tanzania, however you say it, Tanzania Energy Development and Access Project provides regulation for project subsidies, financing, and technical assistance. The country has been ranked among the top 10 countries globally, actually, for establishing sustainable business models for renewable energy-based mini-grids. Finally, if we look at South Africa, whilst rural electrification rates are over 77%, there are still people with no access to electricity, and this can be addressed by mini-grids. In addition, there's a growing percentage of urban communities and private owners who seek to go independent from the grid through renewable-based self-generation. Flexible generation and grid feeding is catching up amongst local municipalities. Moving on to the next section, which is smart metering. I'll primarily try and focus on AMI, or advanced meter infrastructure, as this is the key foundation required before we can actually move to a truly smart energy system. So starting with a short global snapshot, the market reached 115 million units in 2015, which was a new record. Whilst this is forecast to be the peak, the market is expected to achieve an average of 85 million installations per year up to 2025. China gradually declines in terms of volume contribution. Other markets are emerging to fill much of the gap. Japan is already a key global market, and France and the United Kingdom are expected to install more than 10 million units a year till 2019. From a company point of view, Chinese companies dominate the market, but Landis+Gyr are still the largest global player. Europe, the Middle East, and Africa has emerged as a key regional smart gas market ahead of North America, driven by rollouts in Europe and growing demand in the Middle East and Northern Africa. While sales in North America are expected to peak in 2021, the South American market is still at a very early stage. Asia Pacific will become the second largest regional market in the next 10 years. Moving on to the final bullet point of market drivers and restraints, I want to discuss this a bit further in the following slides. So starting with key market drivers, supportive government legislation regulations will drive rollouts in key geographic markets. Without government pressure, utilities and distribution network operators are generally inclined towards a slow pace of smart meter implementation, as the business case is not always strong enough. As a result, we have scored this drive as having a high impact over the coming years, as we see it as a key barrier to a large-scale rollout of smart meters. Looking at the next point here, high levels of non-technical loss provide a business case for electricity utilities to invest in smart metering. As they have a strong role to play in reducing electricity theft and the fact that they protect utility revenues, this acts as a powerful business case for the installation. In markets where there is no smart meter rollout or supportive legislation, we find that utilities are still prepared to install smart meters in areas of their distribution networks where there are high losses. The third point there of smart meters are the key bedrock component of a future smart grid. As we are still in the early stages of the smart grid revolution, or evolution I should say, in the near term this is not a major driver, but as the energy grid moves to a more smart grid setup, it will become of increasing importance. Finally, the last point there of the effective integration of renewable energy has only been possible with smart meters. This is because smart meters track the detailed inflow and outflow of electricity in the system. It accounts for the surplus and unconsumed energy generated from solar and wind power that gets fed back to the grid, enabling consumers to take advantage of feed-in tariffs, as well as allow the grid to handle the uneven electricity generation from solar and wind turbines, and therefore optimize the use of renewable energy. Moving now to the key market restraints. First, we see the issue of a lack of supportive business case if there is no mandate for smart metering, unless there are high levels of electricity theft. Smart meters and the supporting communications and data analytics infrastructure cost considerably more than the conventional metering, and consumers are very often reluctant to pay. Usually the distribution system operator bears the cost, which is passed on to consumers as additional network charges. The impact of this, though, will decline over time as cost for meters reduce, meaning their uptake should increase. Secondly, there is a preference for basic metering. The cost of a basic electricity meter can be as low as $12 to $15. I stand corrected here, but I think the cost of a AMI meter is about 10 times that, so $120 or $150. In countries where metering of electricity occurs only partially, installing basic meters is the quickest and easiest solution available. Moving on to the final point here, uncertainty over choice of technology and also the approval process for technologies and standards is expected to slow down demand for smart meters. The reason for this is that there have been major technological advances and changes in the past 5 years related to the communication and data analytics software that supports smart metering. Moreover, as only a few countries have rolled out smart metering, the number of best-in-class examples is limited. This has made many utilities obviously hesitant to invest, as they are skeptical of making the wrong decision and selecting a technology that is superseded by a better option. Linked to this are delays by regulators in approving technologies and standards. This process can sometimes take an excessively long time, as regulators are too slow and cautious in their approval process. This restraint, though, is expected to become less prominent as the tech curve flattens out and standards are put in place. Looking now at African meter numbers, one can see that there is market potential, particularly given the need of most electricity utilities to tackle chronic high network losses due to the non-payment of bills. But increasing access to electricity is still the main priority, and penetration of even basic meters is very low, often in single digits. Much of the current market in Africa is still dominated by basic, traditional electronic metering. Although there are trial smart meters projects, many using AMR technology, the African market remains dominated by conventional, static, non-AMR prepayment metering, which accounts for 6.3 million of the 6.6 million non-RCG meters. Africa also lacks the infrastructure to support smart metering. Communication between meters and a central location is challenging, and utilities have limited data handling capabilities. Financing is also a big issue, particularly in countries such as Angola, Nigeria, and Algeria, where the public funds are reliant on the oil and gas price, which is not what it used to be. Looking now at advanced metering numbers by country, Algeria has been trialing smart meters at a commercial level and industrial level, with around 97,000 installed between 2012 and 2016. However, the potential for residential metering is limited by a lack of funding, a weak tendering process, and high levels of corruption. Egypt has recently awarded a 250,000 meter tender for smart meters, and shipment of these will start gradually from 2018 onwards. Nigeria has plans to roll out smart meters, a mix of AMR and AMR, totaling 960,000 units by the end of 2018. By 2022, we expect the number to be around 250,000. Kenya has announced plans for a $1.6 million pilot for smart metering, covering light commercial and residential customers with power bills over $1,100 a month. This will only apply to a very limited number of residential properties. Eventually, Kenya Power, the state utility, wants to roll out smart meters to all 2.3 million customers. The country is installing significant volumes of prepayment metering, roughly 200,000 in 2016, and this is likely to continue to be the favored option over a mass rollout of smart metering, although smart prepayment could be the preferred solution in the longer term. South Africa, as you would expect, is still a significant market, and we have that number at around 150,000 units by 2022. For the rest of Africa, there's limited activity for advanced metering infrastructure. Prepayment metering remains the largest area of growth for metering. Moving onto energy storage, I've incorporated figures from our most recent up-to-date study, which was completed in 2016. So total energy storage capacity in 2016 was predicted to reach 6.53 gigawatts. The need for stable power supply, we predicted, would drive the growth of molten salt thermal storage systems or concentrated solar power, or CSP. Supercapacitors will increasingly be used with solar photovoltaic plants for power output smoothing. Renewable power integration from utility scale to residential scale will be a primary driver for battery storage growth. And then residential and commercial storage will be driven largely through government subsidies, and this was primarily in countries such as Germany, Japan, and the United States. The innovation and growth in the EV market will drive technology innovations and scale production for high power density battery systems, driving the lithium-ion market, which we expect to grow at around 39%. Having a look now briefly at the different technologies and where they are in their life cycle. Thermal energy storage and low-speed flywheel energy storage are mature technologies and will continue to drive the alternative energy storage market. Lithium-ion battery technology is growing, being driven, as mentioned before, by the uptake in EV vehicles. As one can see, there are quite a lot of new technologies that are coming along and which are at different points in the market evolution cycle. In order to gain market share, they will need to find large-scale applications which will help drive down their costs and thereby increase their market attractiveness. Looking at the 2016 breakdown of market share by tech type, battery energy storage has the highest growth potential, whilst thermal energy storage has the largest capacity addition. Thermal and flywheel energy storage account for 76% of the 2016 capacity, whilst the overall storage capacity of 6.53 has obviously increased for 2017. We don't expect the percentage splits across the different types of energy technology to have changed that drastically. Looking now at Africa, battery energy storage systems are still in their early stages of development in sub-Saharan Africa. However, the technology holds tremendous potential across all consumer categories, which have traditionally relied on diesel power in the absence of a quality grid supply. With battery storage costs set to reduce over the coming years, the reduced cost will make battery storage more competitive and complement off-grid renewable generation, improving the attractiveness of distributed generation across categories. Remote power systems, off-grid luxury lodges, telecom towers, and mining are set to witness an increased uptake of renewable-based battery storage systems. While battery storage systems will actively replace diesel power, diesel generators will continue to have a significant market as an emergency or backup power solution. Diesel generator manufacturers will be advised to partner with renewable energy EPC contractors and project developers to offer competitive, sustainable solutions to businesses and organizations across consumer categories. Upfront capital cost, though, still remains a major challenge for wide-scale adoption of battery storage. Similarly, stakeholders will also need to address issues pertaining to standardization, testing, and technology upskilling to ensure successful project implementation. The key takeaway, though, from this graph is that battery storage for off-grid remote power systems will witness strong growth, increasing from an estimated installed capacity of 24 megawatts in 2017 to over 165 megawatts in 2025. Growth in residential battery storage systems is largely limited to large households, but adoption of the technology is expected to accelerate after 2020 when technology costs and payback periods become more viable.
Sorry, Travis, if I may interrupt you again here. I have a question from Eric who wants to know, do you have any examples of how battery storage has actually, and renewables specifically, have been used in Africa or are being used in Africa at this current time?
Just give me a second. I'm just going to grab a glass of water.
Ladies and gentlemen, while we're having this very fortuitous break in communication, I'd like to remind you there are a number of questions that have already come through. Please feel free to send your questions through. We will try and get to as many of them as what we possibly can over the course of this webinar. So, please make sure that you utilize this opportunity to tap into Travis's amazing knowledge.
There are two that I can think of. There's one in Cape Town. It's called the Icon Energy Hub, and this is where residents can generate their own electricity through solar PV and also store the extra electricity, and that can be used to meet backup or day-to-day energy requirements. The company involved is Energy Partner South Africa, and the battery technology, I believe, is a lithium iron phosphate. The only other one that I can think of, it's a project in Guinea. The solar microgrid there consists of 5 megawatt solar panels and a battery storage system using, I think it's called a Geographic sodium-ion battery. I know that prior to implementation there, the island was relying on diesel generators, and the people there were actually spending quite a lot of money in order to get access to electricity. So it's definitely been somewhat of a success there.
Thanks very much. I can't promise that I'm not going to interrupt you again, but I'll try and keep it limited to one or two more questions. Sorry about that.
No problem. Okay, so the final sector I want to cover here is e-mobility. Now, I don't want to go too detailed into this slide, but it's important to understand some of the definitions that we have. So to start off with, we have the NEV or neighborhood electric vehicles. These are electric vehicles that have a very short range. The next one is BEVs or battery electric vehicles. They have no internal combustion engine and are purely reliant on a battery. We then have EREVs or extended range REVs, which have an internal combustion engine or another power source which supplies energy to the batteries. And then finally we have PHEVs or plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, which have an internal combustion engine with a motor and battery where the car runs on the battery and switches to hybrid once the battery is complete. There are some other subsectors, and they are FHEV, which is a full hybrid electric vehicle where there's no option to plug in and the battery is charged only through the engine. They can run on just the engine, the battery, or a combination. And then we have MHEV, which is a mild hybrid electric vehicle. The mild hybrids are generally internal combustion engines equipped with an electric machine, allowing the engine to be turned off whenever the car is coasting, braking, or stopped, yet it restarts pretty quickly. I've only sat in one car. I think the BMWs and the Volkswagens have that technology. As I say, I've only sat in one of those cars that's like that. And then finally, there is FCEV, which is fuel cell electric vehicle. But the reason why I've gone through all of these abbreviations and the terminology is because it can be quite misleading when a company like Volvo says that they're going to be doing away with the internal combustion engine, which for many people that I've spoken to believe that there was going to be no form of engine in their car. Now, in actual fact, what this means is that by 2019, their car will either be 100% electric, which in this case there is no motor, or it will be partially electric, meaning that there is some form of motor there, but it will also have a battery. Okay, so now with those definitions out the way, if we have a look at the entire expected sales from an EV point of view, Frost has two projections. We have a highline scenario which sees sales of 32 million units, whilst a baseline scenario sees 20 million sales by 2025. Sorry, excuse me, skipping forward there. The highline scenario is basically where we assume that most of the OEMs are closer to or comply with emission targets with technology advancements and consumer acceptance of electric vehicles. Looking now, this is a graphical breakdown of the electric vehicle sales for 2016. Most of the world is focused on battery electric vehicles, whilst Europe has pretty much a 50-50 split between battery electric vehicle and plug-in hybrid electric vehicle. What I do want you to focus on is the total sales figure of 776,188, if you want to be exact. And the reason for this will become quite clear when I flip to my next slide. So there we have it. For 2015 and 2016, South Africa sold 79 and 41 Nissan Leaf cars respectively. If we take all of the EV cars on the road at the moment in South Africa, we estimate the figure to be 500 units, which is around 0.06% of the total 2016 market. The demand, therefore, for electric vehicles in Africa is not going to be of significant value or impact to the energy sector from a demand point of view. Just to further highlight this point, I would like to have a look at the required charging infrastructure. Once again, there's some small terminology here that I'd like to run through. So your AC slow charge is basically where you can take your car and you can plug it into the local wall or your local house socket. The AC fast charge, you need to have some form of modification in order to draw the higher current. The benefit is that your charging time is reduced from 8 down to, say, 4 to 6 hours. And then finally, we have the DC charging, which requires major modification and the installation of charging equipment. However, your charging time is reduced from hours down to minutes. So now if we have a look at the existing DC charging infrastructure, and the terminology there called CHAdeMO is a form of charging infrastructure, there are 2,050 of these sites across the US. If we look at Tesla's charging infrastructure, their superchargers, there are 328 sites. The superchargers are pretty much the equivalent of going to a petrol station. Their destination points are 1,827, and these are what you would term office parks or shopping centers, so places where you would leave your car for an extended period of time during the day. By the end of this year, so 2017, those numbers are expected to reach 650 and 3,500 respectively. Moving now on to charging infrastructure in Europe. From a DC perspective, from an AC perspective, we have 93,000 normal and 3,000 fast AC chargers. The DC charging points are 8,700 across Europe. With most of these numbers, it's pretty clear, both from the US and Europe point of view, that the demand for electricity from EV is going to be a significant factor, and that's not to mention places like China and Japan, where they are also pushing the EV market quite hard. So now if we compare the numbers that we have in Europe and the States to Gauteng or Johannesburg, for those of you that are not familiar with the terminology Gauteng, we have in total 33, most of which are owned by BMW and Nissan. Note that there are no public charging points in Gauteng. If we then look at Cape Town, which is supposedly the advanced city in Africa or Southern Africa, we only have 8 charging points with 1 public. So from these numbers, it's pretty clear to see that for the foreseeable future, the demand for electricity from EV will not be of great significance.
Sorry, Travis, you know what? While you just catching your breath there, I have a question. With the drive by the OEMs to enter the electric vehicle market, regardless of what the initial numbers indicate, will EVs become more mainstream in Africa?
Well, I think there are 2 things to consider there. The first is that I won't deny that the OEMs are driving the EV agenda, but with many parts of Europe now looking to ban diesel cars, it's highly likely that Africa will become the dumping ground for many of these diesel cars, which means the demand for new cars, let alone EV vehicles, I believe will be limited. Secondly, one also needs to look at the required rollout of charging infrastructure that is necessary to establish an EV market. So, who's going to pay for this? I'm sure a company like Eskom would love to roll it out as it increases their demand base, given they have excess generating capacity. But given the financial issues that they have, I don't see them being able to secure these funds. And then we also need to have a look at from a public image point of view. I mean, without wanting to land-based Eskom, would you really want to have your mode of transport reliant on something that's been rolled out by Eskom? Also, imagine the uproar if someone like Eskom or another African utility had to spend money on setting up an EV infrastructure before the electrification rates in the country were close to 100%. So I don't deny that maybe from a global perspective, yes, but from an African perspective, I think we're quite far behind the curve in terms of EV becoming mainstream in Africa. It does, though, lead into where I think EV is going to have an impact from the energy side of things, both from an African and international perspective, and that is the lithium-ion battery price and the technology. So the battery prices have decreased by about 50% in the last 2 years and is expected to decrease even further. The current average price of lithium-ion batteries for electric vehicles in the range of $250 to $300 per kilowatt hour, depending on whose technology you're looking at. The EV market will drive production, innovation, and cost efficiencies for lithium-ion batteries and the battery systems. The lithium-ion battery market is expected to show significant growth, as demand for EVs in countries such as China really kicks forward. As mentioned before, we predict the lithium-ion battery market to grow at around 38%. As demand for lithium-ion batteries increase, so the price for these batteries will begin to decline further, meaning they should become more mainstream. The decline in price will drive uptake for usage in other applications outside of EV, and this is where I believe the EV market will have an impact on the energy sector. So I hope I answered that question. I know I basically jumped into my next slide, but I've now reached the point where I just want to give a quick summary. So the biggest factors to impact African energy will be distributed generation and battery storage, and this will help in the delivery of electricity to rural areas and help bring renewables on as a mainstream source of electricity. The rollout of smart meters will have a place in the African energy market, but the impact will be driven largely by government, and this means it'll be reliant on the stability of African governments, which at times can be difficult to predict. However, without sufficient market penetration, the ability of utilities and the energy sector in general to move to a smart energy setup will be limited. Finally, whilst EV is growing in importance in other parts of the world, its impact from an African perspective will be most felt in the actual sale of cars. Sorry, not in the actual sale of cars, I correct myself there, but more from the driving down of the lithium-ion battery price, which will make that form of storage, battery storage, more affordable for other applications. So, thank you very much for that. Is there time for questions or?
Travis, thanks so much. I must be honest, when you were going over the EVs, I was looking at that little BMW, and I was actually physically salivating because it is just the most beautiful little car I've ever seen. But those things are expensive at the moment.
Yeah, I just maybe in time as they become more mainstream, and I can see the price coming down. But at the moment, I think it's a very niche market. Well, from an African perspective, we just don't have the subsidies. I mean, if you look at countries like Norway or the Scandinavian areas, they have big subsidies to try and drive that sector. So.
Yeah, I suppose that makes all the difference, doesn't it? But we perhaps have more important issues to deal with first. I would love to be able to go over some of the questions that we've actually received this afternoon, but I am a little bit concerned about the amount of time that we have left to us. So if I may, what I'd like to suggest is that the questions that we haven't had an opportunity to address this afternoon, that we post them to the ESI Africa LinkedIn group, and that will give you an opportunity to respond to them if you're open to the suggestion. And then it also gives the listeners of the webinar an opportunity to engage with one another and hopefully a little bit with yourself as well, so that we can keep this conversation going. I think it's really important for us as people that work in this field to understand how these megatrends are going to affect our business. We've already seen significant impacts in both Europe and the US, and I think that, the forewarned is forearmed, isn't it?
Yeah, no, I'm more than happy to take those questions on later, but yeah, thank you very much for your time.
Fantastic. Travis, thank you so much for your time. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. We will have the audio of this webinar available tomorrow, and Sarah will send all of you a link to the audio so that you can listen to this amazing presentation once again. Also, please, if you have any questions, and of course those questions that we didn't get a chance to address this afternoon, we will post them onto the ESI Africa LinkedIn group. please join us on the group. Let's get a conversation going around this topic, and let's see how these megatrends are going to change the way we operate in Africa. So without any further prattling on my side, thank you very much for being with us, and we look forward to welcoming you to our next webinar. Thank you very much, and goodbye.